In this video, I'm going to look at some more experimental mark making techniques using charcoal and graphite, and different effects that can be achieved in this medium. To begin, I'm rubbing some graphite powder onto the paper using a rag. This gives me a good mid-tone as a starting point for mark making. From here, instead of drawing by adding to the surface, I'm going to use a rubber to carefully remove the graphite. This means that I'll be drawing in reverse, working dark to light instead of light to dark. This is a normal rubber you'd get from a stationery shop. It rubs out fine, but it's quite solid, so you're restricted to using it in its blocky form, and you can only really use the corners or sides for drawing in this technique. A much better option is a putty rubber, which is made of a soft malleable material, which is more suited to being used as an artist tool. You can use the corners for a sharp define line, but you also have much better control over the size of mark by varying the pressure you use with it. You can easily manipulate the shape of the putty rubber to suit your requirements. Here I'm squeezing it into a fine point for detailed linear work, or it could be folded over for thicker calligraphic marks. It can be moulded for smoother shapes, or can be used in an irregular form for more organic and fragmented lines. There are so many possible ways of using it, and it's worth experimenting by actually using this process yourself to really get a feel for this very direct and natural way of mark making. When the rubber becomes covered in graphite, you can fold it back in on itself and reshape it to keep working. The great thing about this process is the additive and subtractive way of working. Starting from this neutral grey, you can lighten by removing the graphite, but you can also re-add graphite if needed. As you work it back and forth, you can create quite dense areas of drawing. You can also take the drawing in the other direction, from light to dark, by adding media on top. Here I'm just using charcoal on top to create a greater range of tones and add another dimension to the artwork. Here I'm going to experiment with the surface of the paper and how it interacts with the charcoal and graphite. I'm just cutting into the paper here with a scalpel. On the second example, I'm using the side of a craft knife to drag across the page to make a wider, rougher line. And on this one, I'm making blunt scored marks with the end of a fork. Now I'm rubbing the powder onto the paper, and you can see how it gets caught in the grooves of the surface and create these precise fine lines that contrast with the soft gradient of the powder. It has a print quality a bit like what you might see on an etching or monoprint. On this last example, I'm using the side of the charcoal stick, just to see if it can be used like a relief print, leaving parts of the white lines untouched. I think these are looking interesting, and I'm going to work into them a bit more, adding some contrast and using the putty rubber to remove some of the surface charcoal to leave the etched lines visible. You can see here in a close-up how the fine lines have an architectural quality, and I love the way the ripped surface has started to become deconstructed and peeling away. The lines on this sample are thicker and have held onto more of the charcoal, giving a more hand-drawn look. The lines from the blunt fork are interesting, as some of them are dark and some are still light, depending on if the powder is forced into the grooves or if it just passed over the top. On this test, I'm looking at ways of making areas darker and denser using a fixative spray. I'm using a flat area of charcoal and graphite, and a charcoal in a linear way to demonstrate this. So now I'm masking off the top half of the samples and using a fixative to form a protective layer. Fixative usually comes in an aerosol can and is best used outdoors or in a well ventilated area, but there are studio friendly versions available. Make sure you leave this to fully dry before applying the next layer. Now I'm just going to do exactly the same again to each sample, and you can clearly see how much denser and darker the media is where the fixative has been added. This process can be repeated again and again to build up darker and darker tones, and you can see how it would improve the contrast or depth of your drawing. For this last example, I'm going to try using water to see what effect that might have on the surface. I'm going to sprinkle some droplets of water onto the charcoal, and whilst I'm waiting for them to soak into the surface of the paper, I'm going to use a stencil to see what sort of marks can be made. I'll try using some sharp lines in charcoal, and I'll also try smudging the charcoal into flat areas. This could probably work well in quite a subtle way, but here I'm going to do it quite bold just so it shows up on the video. I really like how they feel so separate from the background, like they're floating on top, but you can still blend them into the background if you wanted. I also like how they're patches of flat charcoal, rather than a drawn shape with defined drawn edges like this one I'm drawing now. It just has a different edge quality. This stenciling approach works well at building layers, and I can imagine using other materials such as packaging templates or fabrics would achieve interesting results too. Now I'm just going back to this sample, and I'm going to rub the water droplets off. You can see how the water has removed the charcoal in these areas, which gives it a distressed textural feeling. If you work into the drawing now, you see how the paper has become weakened and rough. It begins to flake away when you work into it. Again, this could be a way of integrating a textural and three-dimensional element into your work. With all these processes, it's really worth experimenting and physically doing it for yourself, as there will always be something that comes out of it. For example, when making this video, I glanced down at some of the samples I'd made and found it really interesting how you could see glimpses of one of the drawings underneath the stencil I'd made. It could easily be something as simple as a happy accident like this that sparks a new line of exploration within your artwork.